Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending the Yomiuri International Economic Society YIES 391st lecture meeting. The speaker for today is the philosopher, Dr. Markus Gabriel, and he is a professor at the University of Bonn, and he became the youngest full professor in Germany at 29 years old, and is in charge of epistemology and modern and contemporary philosophy. So he is the superstar or rock star of philosophy. Now the world is facing a variety of crises. A new enlightenment which aims to find the possibility to overcome the crisis through the common ethical perception mankind natural possesses is a focus of attention. In 2004, he became the senior global advisor of the Kyoto Institute of Philosophy, which is pursuing a new value harmonizing science and technology and human well-being. The theme of today is Authoritarian or Ethical Capitalism, Why Philosophy Matters in a Time of Nested Crises. And you see the English title up front. And Professor Gabriel will be speaking maybe about an hour, and then the professor would like to entertain questions from the floor. He's looking forward to questions. And this is being recorded, and at a later date, it will be published online. And my name is Ochi, and I am the research fellow at the Yomiuri Research Institute. So please welcome him with a warm hand. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very grateful to have this opportunity to speak here today. It is an honor for me that I can speak at the Yomiuri International Economic Society lecture meeting for over 50 years. This meeting is one of the most important economic forums in Japan, and with regards to the international position in Japan, it has made deep thinking, and it has been supported by Mr. Shigeru Kitamura, who is president of YIES, and also Mr. Shoichi Oikawa, who is the chairman of Yomiuri Shimbun Group, and also I would like to express my most sincere gratitude to Yomiuri Shimbun. And as a philosopher, I stand at the contact point of various disciplines, and it is an important mission for me that, well, I have trust in the the cooperation is the biggest weapon to confront the various threats. Now, I have just started to learn Japanese, so I have to speak at today's lecture meeting in English, and I hope to have your understanding.
So next time, I promise, not here, but if I'm ever invited again, you'll get it in appropriate Japanese. So this was just an attempt to address you in an appropriate language. Now to English, which is also an appropriate language. So today, this is the program. I will first say what I think ethics is and what ethics is about. Then I will present the challenge that we're all facing, which I call, with many political economists, the authoritarian capitalism as a challenge we're all facing. Then I will offer a solution or propose a solution which I call ethical capitalism, and given that Japan has such a distinguished history in it, I call it ethical capitalism 2.0, with reference to Shibusawa Eiichi, Rongoto Soroban, who started it here in Japan quite a while ago, and who finally made it to the MAN bill last year, I heard. So that's a good sign. And then I will respond to the question why I think philosophy matters in a time of nested crises. So let's get started. What is ethics? What is it about? So ethics is a subdiscipline of scientific philosophy. So let's start there. It's a part of science, and in particular of scientific philosophy. What it studies, what ethics is about, its target system, is what I will call the moral facts. I will tell you what that is in a second. Just like physics is about the universe, that is the material energetic system of which we are a part, in this way, ethics is about something else, namely about the moral facts. In general, a fact is a true answer to a meaningfully posed question. By the way, this entails that there are no alternative facts. This is just a short comment to our American friends. So there are true answers to meaningfully posed questions. That's in general a fact. For instance, here's a question: am I in Tokyo right now? And the answer is yes. Hence, it is a fact that I am in Tokyo right now. That is the philosophical concept of a fact. A moral fact, then, is a true answer to a meaningfully posed ethical question. So here's a very simple ethical question that this person asks themselves. So here's a choice you face. You are in the swimming pool in the summer. It's a very hot day due to climate change. By the way, it is a fact that there's human-made climate change. And so you are very thirsty and want to enjoy your cold drink. But you see that a child is drowning in very shallow water. So now you face the choice: should I get the drink or should I save the child? If you ponder what you ought to do, you have a problem. The great British philosopher Bernard Williams called this the one thought too many argument. So if you still wonder, that's just one thought too many. Okay, so that is a moral fact. And there you see, this will be important. Some moral facts are very simple, right? They are complex moral facts, but that's a very simple moral fact. Now, what is ethics then in general? So let's move on. If I say that a moral fact is a true answer to a meaningfully posed question, then we want to know what are meaningfully posed ethical questions. And I think that ethics has three dimensions. The first dimension I call humanism. It is the idea that moral facts are about human duties. Here you see it expressed by the ancient philosopher Mengzi, just as a very, just a footnote, so to show that humanism, realism, and universalism are not in any interesting way European ideas. You find them long before Mengzi in China, but you also find them in Egypt long before Mengzi. So the idea is very old, that there are human duties that we have simply because we are humans. And then moral facts are norms, meaning they decide whether you do the right thing or the bad thing. So I call that realism, meaning there is a moral reality out there, and it is our responsibility to track the moral facts and not to make moral mistakes. That's part of human freedom and human evolution in particular, as we will see. And most importantly, moral facts are valid for every person. It doesn't matter who the child is in the swimming pool case, nor does it matter who the person is. Everybody who is capable of saving the child ought to save the child regardless of who they are. Another example, easily violated unfortunately, is, for a moral fact, you should not shoot rockets at childcare facilities. And it doesn't matter who shoots rockets at childcare facilities, whether they are our democratic friends or our non-democratic enemies. It is always misbehavior. It doesn't matter who the agent is who sends the rockets. It is exactly like the swimming pool case. This is just an obvious comment on what's happening in the various wars that we see right now. So we can now define, and we begin to move into the economic realm now, based on this thought, some more concepts that we need for what I call ethical capitalism, the type of system that I have been developing over the last decade. So let's coin the notion of moral progress. And moral progress is the large-scale institutional recognition of hitherto partially obscured moral facts. So there are some moral facts that we didn't track. Some people would know them, right? It's often those suffering from the violation, but not only. And if we find systems of large-scale institutional recognition, then we make moral progress. A very simple example of this is the law. That is why in liberal democracies, we combine, as we will see, free markets with the democratic rule of law. That's one of the reasons, because moral progress is not that an individual gets enlightened. That is great for the individual. Moral progress is a social phenomenon which needs to be documented by institutions. So I'm not an activist, as you see. Activists would say, let's fight for the good. Well, that's wonderful, but you need institutional recognition of the good and not a struggle for the good. Sometimes you need both, but moral progress is when you have a law or some other institution, a business, that solves moral problems. That's what I call moral progress. In that respect, you can think of business as a moral innovation lab. That phrase is a summary of my view by the Oxford professor Colin Mayer, who summarized my view with this slogan. He said, Markus says that businesses are moral innovation labs. So here's another comparison which you might find useful. Physics only makes progress because we have particle accelerators. So without particle accelerators and other labs, theoretical physics cannot do anything. But we need both theory and practice. And I think business relates to ethics exactly like particle accelerators relate to physics. That is why if philosophers do not cooperate with business, they cannot make progress, and business needs the information from the ethics, from theoretical ethics, in order to ask the right questions. That's the positive feedback loop that I will continue characterizing today. In short, I believe that values are the new oil of mature economies. Japan is certainly a mature economy. There's a nice distinction I owe to the Swiss think tank Avenir Suisse, of which I am a member. It's also a business think tank. And in the Avenir Suisse, we draw a distinction between aging democracies, and of course, Japan is aging due to great scientific progress. But you might also think of this as a mature economy. So maturity is a completely different way of thinking about this than aging. So aging can be better or worse, and we can think of it as becoming mature. And I think that values are the new oil of these mature economies that we see right now. Germany is a case in point, Switzerland certainly is, many, many other important economies we can think of are in that sense mature economies. China would not be a mature economy yet on that account. It will be at some point, and then let's see how it will behave. So values are the new oil, and data are important because data are documents of values. If you have data, you know how people think and act. And how people think and act is an expression of their values. So data are only indirectly important for the digital economy because values are directly important. That changes the perspective of why ethics matters. So I think that, we can engage in a new practice. This is a forthcoming book. I can only show you the cover because I haven't written the book. So you can only judge the book by its cover. It's called Ethical Intelligence. I will talk about this when I come to the solution strategy of our problems. But importantly, intelligence is a measure of problem solving, hence the investment in artificial intelligence. Learning, including deep learning, is a measure of problem changing, and that's different from intelligence. The AI community is quite confused about that. That's why I draw these distinctions here. And even more importantly, wisdom is the capacity to identify the right problems. I had a wonderful discussion about that just the other day with the president of Google Japan, who has, fortunately, a good love for philosophy. We talked about wisdom. And ethical transformation, so I just wanted to give that to my Japanese friends, is deepening our perception. So I've spent most summer thinking about okubukai, because I know so many people in Kyoto, and my friends in Tokyo always tell me Kyoto is okubukai. So I wanted to understand what this means, and it did change my life. So ethical transformation, thanks to Japan. I'm one of those Westerners who get changed by you, and that's good. Thank you. So another way of putting this is, so this is a proposal by my colleague Christiane Wopen. She's a great and very influential ethicist in Europe. She was the head of the European the European Ethics Committee, and the German Ethics Committee, among other things, has introduced the notion of concrete ethics, which happens to correspond exactly to Kyosei, the big Kyosei movement here in Japan. So there's something that we can do together. Just a footnote, concrete means growing together from the Latin concrescere, and that is literally Kyosei. So there we meet in a very important point. Now, while this was very optimistic, it gets a little darker now, and then it gets light again. So now let's look at some of the tensions of our time. So this is a very important book by FT journalist Martin Wolf, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, one of the most important books about the challenge that I will be discussing. So, first of all, let me tell you, right, why we need all of this. Not all futures are good, right? So, authoritarian capitalism is coming, but it's not there yet. We can still do something about it. And I think, that is not a future worth wanting. Yeah? That one might be better. So that's the book launch of my book on ethical capitalism in Germany. The right person was listening. Okay, so let's get to authoritarian capitalism. What is this? First of all, what is capitalism according to Martin Wolf? He says it's an economy in which markets, competition, private economic initiative, and private property play central roles. Fine. And then he points out that authoritarian regimes, and this is how you recognize them, deinstitutionalize politics. They make it personal. This is government by arbitrary rulers and their courts. Common features of such regimes include a narrow circle of trusted servants, promotion of members of the family, use of referendums as ways of justifying greater power, and the creation of security services personally loyal to the great leader. And if you combine the two, you get authoritarian capitalism, and he thinks there are two forms. Demagogic authoritarian capitalism, and that is an internal threat to democracy. So this is how authoritarian capitalism starts in liberal democracies, by demagogues, and we will talk later about the methods that they actually use. And then there is the big organizational form, which he calls bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism. China is a difficult case. I disagree with his diagnosis. I never thought that China was a capitalist country. I accept their official self-description as Marxist. I think it's been a big mistake to think of China as capitalist at all, but that would be a long talk. So that is the problem we are facing. Why are the slides not moving? There we are. So I think we need a novel diagnosis on top of this. So here's a recent publication that I oversaw. It has some very distinguished economists in it, like Joe Stiglitz, who spoke here, I think, at some point as well. So instead of just talking about the authoritarian, we need to look at what are the economic policies of these regimes, hybrid regimes that we see emerging. The examples that we studied were Brazil, Hungary, Bolsonaro in particular, right? The economic thought of these rising authoritarian regimes, Turkey, and a little bit of Trump 1, which is, we need a nuanced understanding of Trump 1 to understand Trump 2, but we looked at the economic policies and coined them neo-illiberalism. And we can characterize these neo-illiberal economies by 3 features. Labor suppression, so they destroy labor rights or suppress them in particular. Ethno-nationalism, Nihon first, say, or America first, both are well-known expressions at this point. And clientelism, so dinners with bros, for instance, are features where you see this, right? But these are neo-illiberal tendencies. They do not like markets. And the use of market mechanisms in illiberal economies is a function of the creation of illiberal political conditions. So this ranges from illiberal democracies, this is what Viktor Orban calls Hungary, an illiberal democracy, to different types of regimes. So we need good political science to really study, because the regimes are different. It's not one single phenomenon. In general, then, we found, by looking at all these neo-illiberal democracies and their economic strategies, that they are characterized by a shift from entrepreneurial capitalism to conglomerate capitalism, as we call it. So, you do get a tendency towards monopolies and an attack on the very idea of markets. And that is, of course, the definition of the illiberal. The liberal likes free markets, the illiberal hates markets. That's why we have antitrust laws, right, as constitutive of functioning liberal democracies. So I think that's the situation that we are facing, the threat. The slides, there they are. So here's something that is good about my country, and this will play a role in a second. So fortunately, we have a notion which is weaker than Rongoto Soroban, but it corresponds to the spirit of the foundation of Japan's capitalist economy in the Meiji era. So in our constitution, we can read that property and the right of inheritance shall be guaranteed, so that's good news. Their content and limits shall be determined by the laws. That's going to be important in a second. And now, my favorite line from our constitution, property entails obligations. Its use shall also serve the public good. So this is just baked into the structure of our society by definition. But all modern societies have versions of it. It's not a German feature. Everybody does it in different ways. But that's constitutive of liberal democratic capitalism, as Martin Wolf calls this. You don't have to read the whole quote, but I give you the thought behind this that will play a role. The law, which defines the limits of private property and its use, such as antitrust laws and so forth, is also something that we collectively own. The law is something that we all own together so that we can then have private property. The law guarantees private property, and the law is owned by everybody. There's ownership for the law, but the ownership is national sovereignty. Now, let's come to the better proposal and see how we can make this happen, ethical capitalism. So, we have some good support for the idea. So I think there are these 3 very important achievements of capitalism. So I recommend this really great interview with Higashihara-san from Hitachi, who has been pointing out from his perspective why management is not possible without philosophy. And he goes quite into detail from his perspective as a top business leader here in Japan, what role philosophy can play. So I think there are three achievements of capitalism which define it. And that is then what capitalism is. Number one, you have freedom of contract. So we don't have feudalism. So the first is capitalism is not feudalism. Two is capitalism is not a planned economy. It's a market economy. And the third is that we have reinvestable private property. That's the positive freedom of capitalism. Capitalism is not just negative freedom, it is also positive freedom. It allows us to positively achieve something. And I call that reinvestable private property. If you have that, you have capitalism. And then you have different forms of it. Liberal, illiberal, authoritarian, ethical, and so forth. There's an important literature on this called Varieties of Capitalism, right? So there, depending on where you go, capitalism evolves differently because capitalism is part of cultures, of nation states, of traditions, histories, and social systems. And you need to understand all of this in order to understand business in a country. If you think you can understand business by just understanding economic interests, you make exactly the mistake we all have been making. Now, we all thought during globalization, where Japan was very, very successful in various waves of globalization, that you just needed to understand interests. And then you needed some, fairly basic mathematics and numbers in order to make the right predictions and moves. That was a wonderful time when we could believe this, but it only worked because there was a background value agreement, and this background value agreement has evaporated. We are not in the post-war era anymore. It has ended in this century, and the post-war era was characterized by a wonderful idea. I love the idea. It's just come to an end, unfortunately. It didn't fail, it just ended. And the idea was that you need techno-scientific progress, science and technology, which gives you, the right means for production. Then you have business, which generates economic growth, and the rest follows, right? So you solve the human problems, the welfare problems, and all the other problems once you have generated the value, the economic value, by this machinery. Summed up in a beautiful slogan, it's the economy stupid, right? So these were great times. Japan, was thriving on this idea for good reasons. But those times are over. This came to an end. No failure, nothing wrong with the idea, it just stopped. And instead, what we see now is values driving economic activity, some bad values, ethno-nationalism, or Christianity in the case of Donald Trump. Just think of what he said. You have to read his speeches more carefully to understand this. But at the United Nations last week, he was quite adamant about this, or this week even, it's so recent I forgot. But he was so adamant about this and very clearly said, right, Christianity is under threat and so forth. So you need to look at the value things he says. I always said in Trump 1 already, you need to think of Donald Trump as a Christian. I'm not saying a good Christian, but as a Christian. So you need to understand that there are values driving the activity. And then if you want to have an alternative to this, you need to develop your own values. So if we want to continue on the path of liberal democracy, science, technology, and the economy are not enough. So because that has ended. Now we need something more. Ethics, as I would argue, in the sense of value creation through ethical insight. So that's what I call ethical capitalism. Now, in general, and that's why I said, our model has ended, not failed us, it just ended, is that change is part of capitalism. One of my favorite books in economic thought, one of the classics, of course, is Schumpeter's book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. which I think he wrote at Harvard, but he was at Bonn. One of my offices in Bonn is on the Joseph Schumpeter Street, which made me read him. I was like, who's Schumpeter? And so I went really closely into his work, which I think is very, very important to understand the present moment. He says, you know, capitalism is a form or method of economic change. He was one of the first to compare capitalism to evolution. You know, you need biology to understand capitalism. He pointed out very early in this book. And so, you know, like a trivial example is from fossil fuels to renewable energies, right? I will get to Nintendo later. I will call this the Nintendo model. But generally, change or transformation are essential for capitalism because it's a method of change. Famously, he calls this creative destruction. There's one important difference between Elon Musk's economic thought and Schumpeter's. Elon Musk understood destruction, but not creation, right? So it's creative destruction. So that's different from disruption. Sometimes you need to disrupt. This is not a wholesale critique of Elon Musk, who is an outstanding businessman. And I'm just saying that you need both creation and destruction, just like in life. So, some more theoretical background. Recent economic thought has shown, here 2 examples, Colin Mayer's really good book, just out, I think, last year, and the other one is from, you know, neuroscience and anthropology. So Michael Tomasello has shown how human morality evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, actually, out of the human capacity, which scientists call theory of mind, to understand the desire and emotional states of others. So humans are very good, and Japanese are better than most humans at it, to detect the emotional states of others and to react to this. So this is what Adam Smith called sympathy. And I think that what Adam Smith called the invisible hand is not a mathematical law of markets. That was just a mistake when we started modeling that in economics, but it is sympathy. So what we see in the numbers is sympathy. It's just hidden in the numbers, right? It's the culture of the company, it's the meeting at which you negotiate terms, it's the supply chain, it's the relationship B2B, B2C. All of these have to be driven by sympathy in order to produce economic value. So the invisible hand is sympathy, and we must never forget that Adam Smith, the founder of modern political economy, was professor of moral philosophy. So again, ethical capitalism. It's a distinguished British tradition also, by the way, as you can see. Now, a little fact-checking. So this is a famous quote from Elon Musk. Sorry, again, he's a great businessman, but a poor philosopher. I'm hopefully an okay philosopher and a poor businessman, let's see. But here's what he said, you know, the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. And I gave him, you know, a Marubatsu ranking, and he's out on this, okay? So, no, that's, for one thing, it's not Western, you know, it's Buddhism, empathy, so not that Western, and it's not a weakness, it's a strength. Hence, what I call Rongo Tosorobon 2.0, you know, and we are developing in a startup that I founded a transcultural AI system we call the Alpha Buddha for a reason. So it's an AI system that's based on an ethical intelligence, and it turns out, we ran studies on that ethical AI systems need less energy. You can reduce, and that's important for AI, you can reduce the amount of electricity needed to run the AI system. The internal operation is more sustainable if you pre-select information. So what the big LLMs in the US do, they read a whole library of all books in order to answer a question, say, about Japan. They read all books about Italy in order to answer questions about Japan. But if you build an AI that goes to the Japan section of the library, you save the energy that you needed to read the Italy books. That's the idea. It's called an industry competence model. They're easily designed, it's very easy to do, and they're more ethical. So this is just one case out of many of ethical capitalism of how you can do this. Now, some of you might say, well, should we really take this seriously? And then, well, here are some reasons, they got a Nobel Prize for it, so that should be good, right? That's maybe taking things seriously. That's the 24 Nobel Prize. Famously, they have shown that institutional stability is the success condition for nation states in the long run. So if you destroy institutions, you might make short-term, there might be short-term positive effects, no doubt, right? Bad actors can generate surplus value. We know that. But in the long run, due to the empathy problem, you go down. And the empirical proof of this, for this, they won the Nobel Prize. I recommend, of course, also their most recent book, Power and Progress, which is about similar topics. And then you see this Cambridge Elements book, which is the next stage. I think we might see in the next years a Nobel Prize for the type of research that they conducted. They call it a moral political economy. And so there's quite some interesting work on this. But then we might also just, stay at home. And so there's Uzawa, one of the most intelligent mathematical economists of all times, who happened also to be the first to model, the ecological crisis long before anybody spoke about this in the 50s. And he has been well received in Chicago at the time, and the US was very influential on the development of economic thought. So now I come to my last section, why philosophy matters in a time of nested crises. So first, just a brief diagnosis, which I call nested crises. You might have heard the term polycrisis, made prominent by Adam Tooze. And I don't think that we are in a polycrisis, one big crisis. There are many crises, and they hang together in a spiral. Basically, they form a typhoon. So the interesting question is, right, where do you start in analyzing the crises? If you start with the ecological crisis, then you see that some of the geopolitical tensions are about that as well. So the European Green New Deal was not quite in the interest of the Russian Federation, which is part of why they started the war. It's not the full explanation, of course, but it's a part of that war. So if you start from the ecological crisis, everything will look green to you. If you start from AI, everything will look like an AI problem for you, right? If you start from the crisis of liberal governance, then everything will look like a democracy problem to you. But all of those are true. So in a system of nested crises, you get one crisis embedded in the other, and so a spiral emerges, and I think that's the situation that we're in. We're in a typhoon of crises and not in a linear situation. It's very important to bear that in mind, because our solution strategies have to be apt for typhoons and not for a linear attack. That's a very different strategy that you need. And so one thing that I recommend is what I call transcultural cooperation. By the way, that's the Alpha Buddha avatar that we have created. I didn't bring it with me today. It speaks in various languages. These avatars can now easily be produced, of course, online. So I think we need to start by understanding that cultures are driven by implicit values. And what the humanities can do for us in business and politics is they can help us understand cultures. They are often too sophisticated, right? That's good, that's fine. But how about we create a new type of advisor, the humanities advisor, who can tell us how cultures function? Then you would understand, for instance, how Korea outperforms you on soft power, right? So because they use cultural stereotypes, etc. So it would be very important to anticipate the next moves that, say, Korean companies make, because they are very strong now on investing in a very smart way in apparently soft factors. So that's something we need to understand. And this then also allows us to move forward. So there's a very useful concept here, Kyosei, once again, and my reading of Kyosei is due to Takahiro Nakajima from Todai, who has called this human co-becoming. So we need to look at cultures through the lens of human co-becoming. So how do humans organize their societies on different scales, individual, family, up to large-scale formations? Which soft elements are part of this, and then we can invest in this. And I think this is part of, the success of modern Japan, which is why I call this the Nintendo model. So famously, Nintendo blended tradition with tech. It started as a Japanese card game, then they introduced Western cards into the card game, and it's one of the most successful Kyoto-based companies now, who also happened to be lucky with the pandemic because everybody wanted to play Nintendo. So they also had like a good change in the consumer market due to a huge coincidence. But on top of that, they are just a really good company. But of course, now they need to do something else. Video games won't do it. Now they need something else. Let's see what Nintendo will come up with. It's not a new Super Mario game. Yeah? So they need to understand that. I hope they will. Another wonderful example, and I think Japan got that right about cars and Germany got it wrong, you need hybrid models. Because if you have hybrid models, and I think this applies across sectors, including AI, you need hybrid systems, humans in the loop, in order to scale everything at the same time, and then depending on where the market goes, you are flexible. So I think, for instance, Google made the mistake with Gemini that they thought LLMs would be about knowledge. But it turns out LLMs are mostly used for relationship advice. So billions of prompts every day are about relationship advice. Gemini is bad on relationship advice. ChatGPT is very good on relationship advice, better than most of my friends. Everybody critiques it, but the systems are pretty good on this, right? They are not as good as a professional therapist, but they're very good. And ChatGPT scaled everything at the same time, and now Google is in trouble, right? Because they might not be able to catch up with emotional AI. The biggest moment, I think, in recent AI history was the release of ChatGPT 4.0, and Sam Altman just tweeted, or I don't know where he posted it, her, making reference to this famous movie where the protagonist falls in love with his AI system, Samantha, and it's not a beautiful story in the end, but her. That's all he tweeted. Why? Because effective computing is part of the system. They understood very early that they need to detect emotions and not just language. These are really emotion systems and not language systems. And most other companies miss that, which is why OpenAI is leading. So there you see exactly how you do it, right? And so one opportunity, this is full of opportunities for Japan. Just a recent example, I just come from Kyoto. And so there was a robot, so someone was walking around at our conference with a robot. And at first, the Westerners all were like, okay, why does he have a puppet, right? And then it turned out, well, there's a severely handicapped person behind the puppet, lying in a bed and participating in the conference through the robot. That's ethical capitalism. And I can tell you, the robot was the favorite participant of the conference. And everybody, me included, at some point cried when you saw the robot, right? So very emotional. So it is exactly right. And Japan is leading with emotional robotics, as we know, the Ishiguro lab and so forth. So there you have a good, heads up in this type of research. You are already, in a way, global leaders, but there's a lot you can still do. Invest in emotions. You have a competitive advantage. So the last, and then I end, but I think this is something that I really want to, communicate to Japan. I think the socioeconomic mega trend of our times is polarization. So the question is, what is driving polarization? And I can tell you that in my country, we made the mistake of believing that there was no polarization and it couldn't really hit Germany. The last government thought until the very end, I can reassure you, I was part of some meetings where we discussed this with social scientists. I was the only one in the room. I walked out of one event because the German social scientists all said there is no polarization in Germany while it was already happening. There's like, no, it's an English phenomenon. It's like British and, you know, like, don't let your anti-Americanism run wild. It's never wise. Be friends with the Americans, always important. Gerhard Schröder got this right when he called Bush our American friends, even in times of tension. Now, I'm only saying this because polarization has nothing to do with specific local problems. It's not about the working class and resentment and deindustrialization. These are all false explanations. Polarization is a network effect. It's social networks, including Google. It's an SNS phenomenon. It's a bug. Nobody designed this. Nobody was behind this at the beginning. It's an unintended side effect of the social media revolution, and you can prove this. So Kenneth Arrow won a Nobel Prize for the famous impossibility theorem. To summarize this, you know, for this, he has shown that democracy only works if people do not talk to each other too much. So if you have 10 people who have to make a decision about what to eat for dinner, and they don't talk to each other, then and you just let them vote, then they'll make a very good decision. It's called wisdom of the crowds. And the more people you have, and the more votes you have, the better the decision gets. Here's one problem. If they communicate to each other, they make poor decisions, right? Because they begin influencing each other, right? So how about the fish? I don't really like fish. Well, think about fish, and then the network breaks down. So that's Arrow's impossibility theorem, to summarize this. And the social media all run on this. Classical media have measures that undermine the negative impact of the theorem. That's the mathematics of classical media, you know, pre-social media. So we need a new type of medium in order to solve this. Otherwise, polarization will just hit us. So, like, what I want to tell you is you still have a chance, like another week or two, it's coming, to fight polarization. It's hitting here. So if you think that Sanseto can never have more than 3%, wait until they have 23. So this happened in Germany, and we also thought we were immune. And nobody is immune to polarization because it's a mathematical effect. It's like a law of nature, and we need to study that. But then again, I'm an optimist. I think that with the right business solutions and strategies, we can still win. So here's one way of doing this, a great book I recommend about guardrails, how to design guardrails. It's by some social scientists. They give you the right conceptual tools to do that, to translate this then, of course, into business, but it's the right theoretical framework for this. You know, I call this future-escaping and deep innovation. These are some, you know, just terms for the very idea. Well, here would be another one, but I don't want to play it too in-house because I have the honor of being a senior global advisor to the Kyoto Institute of Philosophy, which cooperates not only with the Yomiuri Shimbun group and other media, but also with NTT. But that's a really great project as well. You know, NTT is quite right in investing in photonics, you know, optical computing. Of course, we need light rather than electricity for computing. It's way more sustainable. So transforming infrastructure already to anticipate the photonics revolution by scaling up is another example of ethical capitalism as I understand it. I could give you many, many examples of how this works. So this is just me being, you know, this is a good terminator, but I won't talk about this. And instead, you know, let me just say, let's lead not just in markets, but in values. And let me thank you again for the immense honor of speaking to such a distinguished group. And I think we might still have time for questions, but that is entirely up to the organizers. So, domo arigatou gozaimasu.
Gabriel 教授、どうもありがとうございました。Danke.
Now then, I'd like to use the rest of the time in taking questions from the floor. If you have a question, And I see hand in the floor already, but please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, Kumagai-san. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I am Kumagai of Daiwa Research Institute. Up until last year, under Suga and Kishida administrations, I was a special advisor to the cabinet for 4 years. Now, talking about ethical capitalism, which I wholeheartedly support, to deepen discussion here, allow me to act as a devil's advocate. There may be some skepticism toward ethical the capitalism. Some say whether this is realizable, what kind of means would be used to realize that? In other words, whether it is possible or the means and the tools to realize that, that seems to be more controversial than achieving the goal. For instance, something ethical that could be different from country to country. And what is called the ethical washing, just like a greenwashing, pretending as if the one is ethical and then try to hide his or her action. And in reality, in Gaza and President Trump and then the Ukraine, and President Trump is supported by the large number of the people, and therefore whether the right ethics that could be realized or not, that's where I have a big question about. So in that sense, eventually, of course, I would support this concept, but when it comes to means and tools, the practical menu to work with, or something that is enforceable as a scheme or mechanism, that has to be introduced. So what is your view on that? That's one question, and then I have another question. Because this is such a great opportunity. Right now, the presidential election is going on at LDP. And once the one is elected as a president of LDP, then he or she is likely to be promoted to prime minister. What do you expect from the new prime minister? Because you are versed in the situation in Japan, if you have an advice to the new prime minister.
So much. So I've been following, in particular, during Kishida-san's administration, the discourse on Atarashi Shihonshogi, right? So there's been a very important discussion, at the political top, of course, in this country. And at the time, I had the pleasure of speaking, several times at Keidanren and on the top to have discussions about that. This is part of what influenced me to write this book on ethical capitalism, which is why I published it in Japan first, actually. At the time, Germany was still too socialist left-leaning, so I hoped the book would not be published in Germany, but the tides have shifted, and then the book came out, so I got lucky. I avoided the shitstorm of coming out as a capitalist in Germany. That's not great in the media. But that's just gotten a little better lately. So that's just a little footnote, but I will say something about possible advice. So the mechanism, I think, in order to develop the mechanism, right now I focus specifically on business. But of course, the mechanism for politics has to be, in a democracy, provide good laws. Politics is about writing good laws. And I think a good law is a law that fosters economic activity, free market society. So industrial policies are very dangerous. And that is why the LDP, fortunately, in that case, has been running the country for such a long time. It's a liberal democratic party after all, so I know you're very careful with industrial policies. And that's good. But then the question becomes, right, which legal mechanisms do we create of measuring ethical success, and how do we get the values right, which we then use in business? My very concrete proposal is to create teams within businesses. It's a business proposal, first and foremost, that study ethics within the company and outside of the company, with the interest of the company itself, of course, with business interest, identify values in their activity realm, and then invest in the values. This has been a business strategy, of course, in the 1950s in Japan. I'm talking often to either heirs of the great business people, had a good dinner the other day with the, Tateishi family of Omuron, You know, like there you have one of those great thinkers, right, who invested in ethical thinking to build Omron on this, very clear case of ethical capitalism. If you have good blood pressure measurement, right, health, you do something good. So I think business is the way to identify the values, not public debate. In public debate, we will disagree, because that is the function of public debate. In public debate, we want to generate dissent in order to get democracy going. Democracy is about taking decisions that are trade-offs, right? Compromise. Democracy is a system of compromises. So you can never get the ideal solution in democracy. And democracy is really great at doing that, which is why I always say democracy is the best government at not being the best government. But that is a strength. So the mechanism then, to put it as bluntly as I can, is establish research teams within business who do the kind of thing that these genius business giants in the 50s in Japan, you know, all were doing, right? Anticipate the future based on value anticipation. That's the method. That's how they were all so successful, which is why you also have these long lineages, of course, of family names. Japan is the country with the highest density of family-named companies in the world, more even than Germany. So I think that's where we need to start. Now, these international geopolitical tensions, of course, play a role there, but, you know, the idea is not to solve the biggest problems of humanity. That can't be done, as we see. That's part of why the United Nations do not do for us what we want them to do. So we need to start bottom up, right? So business by business, individual by individual. It's a business strategy on my picture. And, but one more thing, and then you see the mechanism. The most concrete thing I can give you is design systems. We are doing this in various research contexts. In Kyodai, there's a group doing this too. Design systems, AI systems that study in large data sets what the values are of the actors and then invest in the value of the actors. You need to trust good human nature, right? That's part of the story, but there's reason to do that from behavioral economics. So it is reasonable to assume that, you know, if you have large data sets, you get good behavior. And then the AI needs to tell us what the values are. Humans cannot detect the values alone because we all have our isolated perspective. At KIP, we call this the multi-layered society. So you measure all the layers of a society, and then you find the average, and that is the value of the society, and then you invest in that. That's roughly how the strategy goes. For governments, I would say, for the next government, design policy frameworks that make possible for business to invest in those values. Create ethical AI systems, invest in all the, you know, like the healthcare stuff that you're good at, for instance, energy solutions. Invest in these ethically relevant markets. I call this, it's a good anti-cyclical strategy, right? It sounds weird to invest in ethics in Trump too, but that's the right way to go. Go anti-cyclical. You know, otherwise the wave hits you. That's what I said. The typhoon comes, what do, right? Don't dance with the typhoon. I hope this is useful, but we could look into great detail of how to design such mechanisms, because there's a lot of game theory behind this.
若田部様お願いいたします。
若田部さん。
I'm a professor of economics at Waseda University. I used to be the deputy governor of the Bank of Japan from 2018 to 2023. So I like very much about what you said. And in economics, actually, we are kind of rediscovering the values, traditions, and cultures, including religions, matter a lot. So that actually your talk is in tune with the recent trends in economics. Having said that, I see some tensions in your talk. First, I think you believe in the kind of moral progress. And I do believe in moral progress as well. But then you come to the second question, in the second part, you talk about the challenges to moral progress. And you seem to imply that this moral progress, although it's desirable, it's not automatically achieved. So by that, I think that I agree with that. So that's lots of questions about the mechanism and the how to implement your vision of ethical capitalism comes into play. I have three the specific questions. One is about the sources of polarization. You just mentioned that it's more like a human nature to become polarized. But I don't think, I think that there are more to that, like the income inequality or the impact of technological change. As you described, that the advancement of AI may have a destabilizing effects on many things. So what do you think about this, the sources of polarization? And second question is, can we think anything about, for example, the political institutions themselves? So I am not in favor of that, but some are actually advocating epistocracy. So that's the, maybe the current style of democracy is not fitted to solve the current problems. So that some would advocate some form of, that's another political institution like the epistocracy. What do you think about that? And third part is values. I think it's quite apt to describe values in plural terms. So that, it makes us wonder that if we have the plurality of values, then what we should think about is that the sort of contests of values and conflicts of values, and that whatever we can call ethical capitalism, maybe that ethical part has many meanings. So that there is no one sort of ethical capitalism, but the plurality of ethical capitalisms. And maybe, the ethical authoritarianism, maybe. So what do you think about this, the plurality of values? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. These are, of course, all very important questions. Our universities, Bonn and Waseda, are partner universities. I like that, so welcome one of our partners. And just a little footnote between, like a philosopher of economics and an economist, the background, a lot of this is Rainer Selten's Nobel Prize that we got in Bonn in game theory, morals and markets. So there's a lot of this, just a footnote for us. So sources of polarization, of course it's multi-causal, right? Take, one of the, so we always have these triggers, which German sociologists call trigger points or inflection points for polarization. One of them, take the recent Japanese case, the rice price, has doubled. And as we all know, part of the political crisis that we see right now, many of the LDP crises lately had ethical dimensions, right? Worries about corruption, or most recently just the rice and what's been said about the rice prices, all of this much better than I do, right? So, and there you have a reality, right? Inflation, driving rice prices, ecological change driving rice prices, false investments, a complex system of why the rice prices have been rising that rapidly. And then, of course, the devaluation of the yen, right? Plus over-tourism. These are some major polarization triggers in Japan, right? So if you cannot even eat well or go to a hotel in Kyoto in the nicest seasons, it's just unaffordable for most Japanese, right? Then that is very, very dysfunctional. I think that, these are the trigger points, but they need not lead to polarization. They could lead to all sorts of things. Revolutions, right? Or quietism or religions. It's interesting that they trigger polarization as a new phenomenon. So, but it's a trigger, so it's certainly part of polarization. But given that the triggers are different everywhere, right? The German triggers are quite different. Some are similar, migration, but they're different triggers. I think the triggers are part of the full explanation, which we do not yet have. We do not have a comprehensive theory of polarization. But I think the way in which polarization spreads is an online phenomenon, digital connectivity. So that's why, but we need to combine those. But if we just solve, that's also for government important, if we just solve one of the triggers, we haven't solved the problem. Take the Biden administration. How often did we hear that the Biden administration is doing economically well by all parameters? It didn't help at all. They could say as often as they wanted, we are doing great, right? And the facts were not important enough because polarization, right, was already happening. Angela Merkel nicely put it, when she said, I'm not going to be re-elected, that's it for me. She said, gave various reasons, and one of them was that we live in a post-truth era, postfaktisches Zeitalter, as she said it. And she said the post-truth era is one characterized by emotions. And she was an epistocrat, physicist, very rational governance, good in a pandemic to have. But that failed precisely, right? She was like, okay, no, I'm out. And now she's traveling the planet and giving good advice. So that's also nice. She was here recently, I heard. So that's, that's on polarization, some comments. Epistocracy, wonderful, but I think that's the danger. That's the Harvard model. That's part of the problem that we see in the US. Like a replacement of democracy or like a reduction of the degree of democracy with the type of evidence-based, makes the population nervous, right? If all of Japan was just one university, then that would be the right thing to do. But even then, you still have to have a dean. So, like even within universities, right, which are epistocracies, we have political power problems, right? So even there. So I think that, unfortunately, we cannot replace democratic decision-making by knowledge. That's part of why Trump is winning politically. Because that's why he's going precisely after that, because value questions are not scientific physics questions, say, right? So, I think this is complicated. As an academic, of course, I love the idea that we are running the country, right? But that might not function, this experiment. And the last, very important, of course, we need to think of values in plural terms. And need to understand that we have no overarching value system on which we can just rely, like a world religion or a world ethos. There's just no such thing. So what we can build is new communities. So Takahiro Nakajima at Todai calls this universalizing instead of the universal. So we start with more local phenomena and then bring the local phenomena in global conversation. Right, so at the Kyoto conference this week, for instance, we had many conversations about the relationship between Buddhism and Shintoism and Ubuntu and other African philosophies. So there are some similarities and some stark differences. But if you find similarities across very different value systems, you create a new value system, right? And then you scale this up without trying to achieve an overarching value system. So you can have pluralism and make more progress. So there's a third option where you fully respect the pluralism. And thank you for the point. I hadn't thought about this. You're, of course, absolutely right that there are different ethical capitalisms. The Indian one would be very different from the Japanese one or the German one. There would be an overlap of similarities, but not identity, because we have nation states and sovereignty. And sovereignty is also constitutive of democracy and capitalism. So we will have a plurality. And yes, we can have ethical authoritarianism, right? So we don't want that either. That was another problem that of the Democrats in the US. They thought that they had found like a set of universal values, that they could just implement them in society. And there was a tendency towards precisely ethical authoritarianism. While close to my heart, I shared their values, right? I think it was a huge mistake by the American Democrats to try to impose their values on everybody else. If about half of the population is religiously fundamentalist, you got to respect that, whatever that means, right? The government cannot say, you have to be atheists. That would not be a liberal democracy either. So the Democrats did not have any good way of dealing with the phenomenon of religion. They were completely blind to this. By the way, also happening in Germany right now. It's gotten a little bit better, but that's something indeed we need to take into account. Sorry for being so long, but these were, again, very good questions.
ガブリエル教授、どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Professor Gabriel. It is already a time to close the lecture. I'm sure you have not exhausted all the questions, But with this, I'd like to bring an end to today's presentation.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.